Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to Powering Up Pledges and Pathways at the first ever virtual New York Climate Week. We're so glad you could join us. I'm Alex Carr, the Director of Special Projects at the Climate Registry. We're a nonprofit organization governed by the majority of North American subnational jurisdictions, so states, provinces, and territories. And for over 10 years, we've been running programs and developing tools and services that help build capacity in greenhouse gas measurement, reporting, and verification. And that's led us to the initiative that we're going to be talking about today, the Carbon Neutrality Database. So as you all know, the concept of carbon neutrality or net zero is not only central to the international and national conversations in the context of the Paris Agreement, but it's also a big part of the conversation that organizations around the world are having about ratcheting up climate ambition and action, which is an increasingly urgent conversation. So in light of this, we're thrilled to be here today with all of you to talk about the database and how we can have an even bigger impact together. So today's session is a session in two parts. The first half is a moderated conversation between the Climate Registry and three very insightful panelists from diverse organizations, talking about the challenges and opportunities associated with carbon neutrality. We'll take a very quick break, and then we'll reconvene for the second half, where we'll reveal details about our Carbon Neutrality Database project, and also get your thoughts and input on a number of key components. So before we get started, I've just got a few housekeeping notes. So FYI, the session will be recorded, and you'll be able to access it later today. You're all on mute, but there are a number of ways that you can engage with us and each other throughout the session. You can access the chat function at the bottom of your screen, but I'd really like to draw your attention to the Q&A feature, which is also accessible at the bottom of your screen. We will be getting to your questions at a number of points during the session, so I'd encourage you to submit these at any time. And do note that you can upvote a question by clicking the thumbs up icon. We're also going to use polling to get your input and feedback on a number of topics as we go through. And note that your answers are anonymous when we do conduct polling. And speaking of which, let's start with a poll and kick off with some level-setting questions with respect to how you and your organizations are considering carbon neutrality. So you'll have 20 seconds to answer 3 questions. And note that you need to answer all 3 before you submit. So with that, go ahead and answer these questions now. And there it is. Okay, last few questions to get your answers in. Okay, we're hearing that there is no poll showing online. Alex L., how are we doing? So for some people it has worked.
Yeah, we've received quite a few responses.
Okay, great. So should we take a look at the answers now, Alex? Okay, so pretty even split between whether your organization has set a carbon neutral target. That's great. Great fodder. Both groups will be able to provide great fodder for the conversation. For those of you who are who have got a neutral or net zero target, the majority of you are looking at a 10-year time frame, so 2030. And then for those of you who haven't currently got a carbon neutral goal, a lot of you are looking at setting one within the next 3 to 10 years. Interesting. Thank you for your responses. That's great. So with that, I'm now delighted to introduce our panel. Welcome to Niclas Svenningsen, Manager for the Global Climate Action Team at the UNFCCC. Hi, Niclas. Erica Bowman, Director of Resource and Environmental Planning and Strategy at Southern California Edison. Idan Dion, VP Environmental, Energy and Chemical Management Programs, Corporate Environmental Affairs at IBM. And last but not least, our very own Amy Home, the Executive Director of the Climate Registry. She's going to be our moderator for this conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Amy. And I think you're on mute, Amy.
I am unmuting and starting my video. Hello, thank you, Alex. And hello, Niclas, Idan, and Erica. We're going to dive in here because we've got a lot to talk about today, a lot of issues swirling around carbon neutrality and net zero and all that good stuff. So Niclas, I want to start with you and see if you could paint us a picture of the international context for carbon neutrality and net zero targets.
Okay, yes, of course, and thank you so much for having me in this panel. It's an interesting topic and something that is close to my heart, of course. So I am working with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UN Climate Change. We are the part of the UN system that is trying to help all the governments of the world to work together to tackle the climate change threats that we have today. We have 197 parties. We have been working together since 1992. And I think what we are most well known for today is the Paris Agreement, which was adopted 5 years ago, and which essentially is a blueprint for how the governments of the world will work together to meet the climate change threats. Now, the Paris Agreement doesn't actually talk directly about climate or carbon neutrality, but it talks about the 2 degrees target and the 1.5 degrees target. It basically commits all the signatories to the Paris Agreement to keep global warming 2 degrees Celsius below pre-industrial levels, with an ambition to keep it below 1.5 degrees target, 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the question that everybody is asking, what does that actually mean? And our Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which is the part of the UN system that is really collecting and synthesizing all climate studies, research, science that is going on from over 130 countries around the world. They published a report 2 years ago that was called the 1.5 degree report. Not such an inspiring name perhaps, but an interesting report. And what that said basically is that if we are going to reach the 2 degree targets, we need to reduce emissions by 25% from 2010 to 2030. And then we need to reach climate neutrality by 2070. If we are going to reach the 1.5 degree targets, we need to reduce emissions by 45% from 2010 to 2030 and reach climate neutrality by 2050. So it's an urgent and it's a tall order, but we are committed to it. So the question here is, of course, what does climate neutrality mean? Well, when we are talking about climate neutrality or carbon neutrality, there are a few different terms, but they basically mean the same, more or less, is that the impact that we as humans, our society has on the global climate is net zero. So yes, we can still emit greenhouse gas emissions, but they should not exceed what is naturally absorbed into the forest and into the oceans that we have. Maybe 1 or 2 more things just to mention here. The Paris Agreement talks, it's an agreement among governments, but it actually also talks about the role of what we call non-party stakeholders, which is a horrible name, but because it really means private sector, civil society, sub-national authorities, cities, and all of us, you and I as individuals. And it basically recognizes that all of us have a climate footprint. We all can do something about that climate footprint, so we have a role to play. And one of the things that the Paris Agreement did was also to ask us to track what is happening, not about climate neutrality, but about climate action in general, whether it's going all the way to climate neutrality or not. So we have something we call the Global Climate Action Platform, or the NASCA platform, which is tracking commitments by non-party stakeholders. So today we have some 18,000 different actors, private sector, cities, civil society organization, that have committed to almost 28,000 different actions to address their climate footprint. It sounds impressive, but it's far from enough. So I think that is the picture we have now. There is definitely a commitment towards climate neutrality, and we've started the journey, but we're not there yet.
Exactly. Do you want to talk a little bit about Race to Zero and some of the other United Nations initiatives?
Yes, thank you. Absolutely, I should do that. So, yeah, I'm coming back to the Paris Agreement. It's our our stick we're using all the time. So the Paris Agreement also says that in order to help the civil society and private sector and the non-party stakeholders to work together, there are 2 high-level champions that are being appointed on a rotational basis. So it's a current president of our Conference of Parties, our COPs, which right now is Chile, because COP25 was hosted by Chile, and the incoming president. So COP26 will be in United Kingdom. So it's a UK high-level champion we have there. So these 2 high-level champions, they are responsible then for facilitating and promoting climate action among non-party stakeholders. Our 2 high-level champions, I shouldn't mention them by name, because if you are attending other events in the Climate Week, you're likely to come across them somewhere. There's Gonzalo Muñez from Chile, and it's Nigel Topping from UK. So they have started a campaign that they call Race to Zero. And basically, this is a campaign where they are asking non-party stakeholders to sign up to net zero emissions latest by 2050. So as of today, we have 452 cities, 22 regions, 1,100 businesses, and 45 of the biggest investors, as well as 549 universities who have taken this target, and we are getting more commitments every day. And this, of course, is not only for people to make the commitment to starting their own work, but it's also to encourage other actors who are not there yet to make the commitment and starting to work together to decarbonize our economy. So that is one thing, but the UNFCCC and the Climate Change Secretariat has been working on climate neutrality for a much, much longer time. Even before the Paris Agreement, we started something we call the Climate Neutral Now initiative, which is a call to, again, non-party stakeholders, but we actually call them private sector and civil society and citizens and individuals to do 3 simple things, which is to measure your climate footprint, understand where your climate footprint is coming from. Secondly, try to reduce that as much as possible. And if you cannot reduce that entirely, which is not possible for all of us, then to consider to compensate that through the use of credible offsets. And the second part there, the reduction part is really quite important, I think, because it's not only about what I can do, but it's also what companies can do to help their customers, and civil society organizations can do to help citizens to reduce their emissions. I mean, as individuals, we are depending on our governments and on service providers to give us the ability to reduce our emissions. And I think there's a lot of things that is happening there, and much more can happen. Maybe 1 or 2 just quick reflections on this is when we're saying reducing much as possible, we're talking for individuals about their lifestyles, how we travel, how we eat, and so on. And many people have told us, no, you can't change. It's impossible to change. But I think what we have seen with the pandemic now, with COVID-19, that yes, actually we can change when we understand that we have to. And that understanding still to come for many people. The other thing is, of course, that when we started this Climate Neutral Now initiative 5-6 years ago, there were not many people talking about climate neutrality, and people said, you're crazy, you can't talk about climate neutrality. Today, climate neutrality is something that is pretty much accepted by everybody. It's something that is, as a concept, not everybody has committed to it, but people understand what it means. And we are moving forward now and seeing more and more actors calling for climate positivity instead. So not only reducing and going down to zero, but also help others to reduce their emissions. But I don't want to hug the microphone anymore, so I'll stop here for now.
Well, thank you, Niclas. And we're going to just hold on because I do want to come back to you, but I do want to pivot to hear both from an energy provider and an energy consumer about their strategies to navigate a carbon neutral future. So first off, Erica, last year, Southern Southern California Edison published Pathway 2045, an update to the clean power and electrification pathway, which maps out a plan for supporting California's transition to a carbon neutral economy. Can you tell us about some of the most important findings that came out of that process, including both opportunities and potential barriers?
Yes, thank you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about this. I did want to just plug that we as an organization, we're still in with COP25. It's something that we are very much aspiring to and are very committed to meeting these emission reductions. I think to your point, we really view ourselves as an enabler technology, an enabler fuel to really support everyone across the value chains, supply chains, et cetera, to achieve carbon neutrality. And in our work with Pathway 2045, what we were doing was examining not just, we looked at both the economy-wide solutions as well as the electric sector, doing a deep dive in what it means for the electric sector to really play that enabler role so that we hit those carbon neutrality targets. So just in California, just for a background a bit, we do have an executive order that was issued by Governor Brown in his last term that California meet carbon neutrality by 2045 and then negative emissions thereafter. And then we also have a law called SB 100, which is really requires that the electric sector goes to zero carbon emissions by 2045. So those were two driving forces behind kind of the studies that we were looking at. And what we found is in order to hit carbon neutrality, over three quarters of transportation needs to be electrified. 70% of buildings in 2045 need to be electrified, meaning that heat and space and water heating using heat pump type technology. And then the rest of the hardest to electrify kind of areas like in the industrial sector or maybe long haul transportation or more heavy use vehicles such as off-road, et cetera, they really need to be using a low carbon fuel. Even with that, we still had about 100 million metric tons of emissions in the California economy. And so there really are additionally breakthrough technologies that are needed to achieve that. And we see that hydrogen playing a big role in that kind of breakthrough technology, as well as potentially biofuels, et cetera. But again, I think what really comes out of that is there's a lot of research and a lot of investment that needs to happen for the research and development side. And I think that's something that we need to continue to push because the actions we take today really matters for what will be possible in 2030 and 2045. The other piece is we did a deep dive into kind of what all that electrification means for the electric sector, as well as what does it mean for the electric sector to grow in order to support that additional load. So we were seeing with 75% of vehicles being electrified as well as 70% of buildings, that our load was growing about 60% from today's levels, which is quite a lot, especially given that historically, in the past 10, 20 years, we've seen a lot flatter loads and a lot less electric load growth. And so there's just a big push for building out not just the resources, but also the transmission and distribution systems that are needed to support that type of load growth. And the basically kind of customer side technologies such as rooftop solar and potentially even storage, behind the meter storage to help support all of this. So there's a lot to do. I think another important finding and key takeaway from the work that we were doing is there's a lot of existing tech. I mean, we have a ton of technologies ready, available today that just need to be deployed and adopted. We can get so far into decarbonization just by using the technologies today. So while we talk about the need for research and development, that's not an exclusion to just taking action today to adopt the electrification technologies, to buy an electric vehicle, to change out your building, whatever the space and water heating is to a heat pump, to really kind of go down that path using wind, solar, battery storage technology in order to decarbonize the electric system. So yeah, that's where we are.
Thank you for that. What are some of SCE's actions and plans to help support this transition? You've talked a lot about retrofitting and emerging technology. And so what is SCE actively investing in or looking at as potentially having the biggest bang?
Yeah, so recently we applied, so on the electric transportation side of things, like we really view ourselves as helping to create the infrastructure needed, the fueling infrastructure to support folks being more comfortable with adopting electric vehicles. Because right now, and it's been this way for a while, and it's something that we need to overcome, is really the range anxiety associated with electric vehicles. So we had a pilot program called our Charge Ready program, where we were deploying away from home charging infrastructure at workplaces, public areas such as like shopping malls, except different areas for kind of considered in the public space, and as well as multiple unit dwellings, so like apartment buildings, condos, etc., because this are kind of unique and a little bit more difficult to install. So we filed an application a couple years ago called our Charge Ready 2. It was a $750 million application. Ended up, we got approval for about 400 million of that recently, just in the last month. So we're working full on to start deploying that infrastructure and really kind of filling the gap, because when we look at at today's levels of electric vehicle adoption, we're actually kind of surpassing, the vehicle numbers is surpassing kind of what's there to support from a fueling side. And so really to start ramping that up so that folks feel comfortable in adopting those technology. On the building side, we're definitely advocating for increased standards for building electrification. That's more on the mandate side. We're also looking at different incentive programs that could help people to overcome some of the initial kind of upfront costs to adopting these technologies, because on the backside, there really are consumer savings, but that we're still working through those processes.
Wonderful. So I'd like to turn now to talk to Edon, who with IBM is actually a customer of Southern California Edison for their California operations. And Edon, IBM's first formal environmental and energy corporate policies date way back to the 1970s, and the programs supporting them have been embedded within the company's corporate-wide environmental programs since that time. So can you give us a picture of what is IBM's approach to carbon neutrality?
Sure, Amy, and thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel with Niclas and Erica. So in IBM, what we are focusing, we continue to focus on, it's interesting you mentioned about our commitment back to the 70s. That was the first oil embargo during which we formalized our program. Obviously, like many businesses, conserving energy, it's good for the bottom line. So business has been doing that for decades, right? That's nothing new. But the oil embargo really forced us to say, we're going to formalize this program, and we never let up. So we maintained that program, a formalized conservation program, meaning we have people actually assigned a job role around the world to do just that. So for us as a company, we have two major levers to deal with mitigating carbon emissions, okay, to answer your question about our approach. Number one is conservation and efficiency and the energy consumption area. And number two is for the amount that we have to consume, we want to accelerate to renewable energy as quickly as feasible, okay? Those are the two things. We continue to find opportunities to invest our money in conservation and efficiency. And we are, you know, in some places, renewable electricity still commands a premium, and we still think that is the right place for us today to invest, as opposed to directing the funding to purchase offsets and become carbon neutral. So to directly answer your question, we do not today claim to be carbon neutral. We could, as I said, we could write that check and buy certain amount offset to do it. But because we still are able, fortunately, to find mitigating pathway, and we're doing that. So for example, last year, we invested money to avoid the consumption of 136,000 megawatt of electricity. That's about 3.2% of what our global consumption is. It's not a trivial sum. It actually requires us to put money in, whether it's light bulb change, going to a more efficient chiller system, you know, doing IoT to better monitor and track our consumptions and so forth. And in addition to that, another two areas, I was glad to hear what Erica mentioned about some companies are in a role to help their clients. So in our case, we both manufacture hardware, mainframe servers, and we also have a $6 billion research division. So that's also places we direct our investment. In the product development area, our top end Z mainframe machine, over the last 15 years, we have improved the efficiency of that machine on comparable models by 93%. Now that's important because many of our clients out there use a machine to manage their workload. So if we can make our machine more efficient, it's better for the world, right? I mentioned about research. That's another area we thought our direct investment will lead to improvement in the society, because we have material scientists. They they focus on battery technology. They focus on material for carbon capture. So we have chemists, biologists, physicists on board. So that's another area we thought our investment will lead to mitigation, okay? Now, I want to say importantly, IBM is 100% supportive of the Paris Agreement, of the IPCC, the objectives of what IPCC 1.5 degree special report. And how do we do that? So in setting our goals, we are now we're almost there meeting our 4th generation CO2 emissions target, okay? So that target's emissions reduction rate exceeds what IPCC recommends to meet the 1.5 degree criteria. And we will be setting our next generation goal, hopefully in the near future, and we'll ensure that we do that. We are even more aggressive in terms of being aligned with the IPCC mandate, so to speak, or recommendation. So that's how what we're doing to support the aspiration of net zero by 2040, 2030. I mean, our goal right now, the rate, it's better than a 2030. And we term it as, we are contributing to the aspiration. I mean, we don't want to claim that we are there, but we definitely ensure that the rate of reduction of our goals are in line or better than IPCC recommends.
Thank you, Idon. And so both you and Erica brought up this need for investment in technology to make a net zero carbon future possible, and also having a crossover with policy and cross-sectoral collaboration. Do you want to add a few more comments about that, Idon? And then also I'm happy to also ask Erica and Niclas to weigh in on that question as well.
Sure, I'm happy to take it first. So I think I will use 2 examples. One, piggybacking to what Erica mentioned, right? We're so glad to hear a utility provider focusing on generation as well as distribution system, right? So for us, we operate in 170 countries supporting clients. And we have data center fleets, large and small. And we very much rely upon what is on the grid. So we work with our utility providers together, whether it's in the regulated, in the United States, whether it's a regulated jurisdiction or unregulated, we support their desire. If there's a way for them to become more flexible, they need a client to support their program, we do that to work collaboratively with our utility provider. So that is one area we do our advocacy. To us, in order for us to really get to net zero, scale is important, right? There are only so many companies who are able to build mega buildings, and then you concentrate, draw from one particular renewable electricity generating capacity infrastructure. But for the most of us, whether it's individuals or other companies, it's the 80% of the bell curve, right? We must have utilities that is able and committed to provide that to us at scale. Just quickly, on a national level in the United States, IBM is part of the Climate Leadership Council, which proposed a cross-economy carbon tax. Now, there are many different ways to incent carbon footprint reduction. So that's not the only way. I'm not suggesting that. But I think what we believe in IBM is that we want to get as many people behind a given program is possible. And we need to really to do so, in other words, to be inclusive, and to do so to operate at the intersection of the interests across as large as a swath of people, government, civil society, individuals, companies. So if we can bring as many people to the table to agree, to see we need to have a carbon program, whether it's tax or cap and trade or whatnot, I think the key thing is to be inclusive. Nothing's going to be perfect, but we happen to think the carbon tax seems to be could be an effective way going forward, and we are supporting that.
Erica, do you have any follow-up comments?
Yeah, thank you. I think I agree with all that's been said, and just I think from our perspective, when we're looking kind of holistically across the economy, one of the areas that we really see a lot of research and development needed today is we can electrify a lot of the economy, and we have the technologies today to do that in a zero carbon way. There is still some affordability and cost things that need to come down on the storage side, but we're pretty much there. I think the question is there's still going to be a need for a low carbon fuel or a no carbon fuel for those areas that you really can't electrify. And I think we really need to focus and really focus on what those choices are, whether that is hydrogen. There's a lot of talk about carbon capture and storage. Maybe it's a combination of biofuels with carbon capture and storage where you're actually creating negative emissions because you're capturing the carbon from biofuels to produce the hydrogen. Like there's a lot of different options there, but certainly I think we need as a nation in the United States and as, across the world as well, really think and be very focused on what are the technologies we're going to go after and be committed to so that when we do hit 2030, 2040, we're ready to go and we're able to kind of get those last 10, 20, 25% of emissions that are needed.
Thank you. And Niclas, from the international perspective, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think, echoing what Edan and Erika said, I really think that the key here is cooperation. And I mentioned the pandemic earlier, and I want to go back to that because it's such a good example for what we need to do. COVID-19 is very obvious that you need to understand what it is, science. You can't just, make up things and say, this is how we're going to deal with it. You need to be science-based. You need to cooperate. Nobody individually, no person, no company, no country can deal with this on their own. We have to work together. And we have to work together across sectors. So it's not only countries working together, it's a public sector working with the private sector. What we have seen on climate change in many places is that there's a lot of good intentions and goodwill in the private sector, but it's difficult to go all the way if you don't have support from proper policy making. And that proper policy making will look differently in different places. In some places, carbon taxes may be the best way, other places, internal carbon pricing through offsetting, in other places, regulation, in other places, just simple education and providing different non-financial incentives. So I think that really to tackle this, we need cooperation and kind of a holistic approach. But I'm quite optimistic. I mean, in many places, we are seeing this happening now.
Well, you all are describing that we have a lot of tools in our toolkit, but maybe we're not pulling them out and using them as we should be doing. Hopefully we will be doing more of that in the future. I have some more questions, but I also want to just check with Alex to see if there were any questions from the attendees for the presenters.
There sure are, Amy. So I've got one here for Erica, NSCE. So are you aiming to get to carbon neutral within your own operations in California, or do you plan to buy credits or rely on other external market mechanisms outside of California?
So in terms of our own operations, we are planning to be carbon neutral, partly because we're required to. SB 100 requires that we are providing electricity at zero carbon by 2045. So we're absolutely planning to that. But additionally, we're thinking more broadly in terms of carbon neutrality and wanting also to help the economy get closer to that across California and beyond, but certainly focus on California.
Okay, great. Another one, I'm not sure who this is for, Amy, but there's no consistent terminology or definitions around setting and communicating carbon neutral targets. So, you know, is this a barrier to understanding and advancing carbon neutral or net zero goals?
I am happy to take a step. Niclas, you
no,
want
please,
to go?
Idan, please go for it.
I'll go first, and you're the expert, really. I think the person asking the question really hit a point. I think there are different ways companies are claiming this, and I think one way to get around is the first step. Maybe it's a baby step, but it's an incremental step. Is to be clear. When we say we are carbon neutral, what does that mean, and how we are going to get there? I think that will go a long way to get at the so-called lack of consistent use of the terminology. I think people generally understand what the term means, but it may not be used in the right way at the right time. Some companies may be more. Take us, for example, we are still investing in mitigation, right? Obviously, we understand we need to prevent the war needs to get there. As Niclas just defined for us what it meant, just means we cannot emit more than what the nature is able to absorb. So we understood, I think that's clear, but it's how we use it. I think we owe it to the public to be transparent and very clear. So that's how I think about it.
Thanks. Niclas?
Yeah, well, I mean, I fully agree with Idan here. The key is really to be transparent. There are a whole lot of different definitions of climate neutrality or carbon neutrality or net zero and so on. And there are definitions for each of them. You know, our go-to place for definitions is always IPCC, and they have an online vocabulary on what these things means, according to them. And then other people may understand them differently. For example, we talk about climate neutrality in UNFCCC because we're not only dealing with carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gases, there are 6, 7 other gases that we're looking at, methane and nitrogen oxide and so on. However, I think that the important thing is, again, that you are clear about what you're referring to with your commitment when you're talking about climate neutrality or carbon neutrality, and that you're also very transparent in how you calculate it. There are different standards today that you can use, and there are more and more calculators coming online, which is helpful. But for me, this is not really a big problem because the fundamental idea, as Idan said, do not emit more than when we can absorb. That is something that we all have in common, I think, and that's important.
Thank you. Erica, did you want to weigh in on this question?
I think it was well covered. Thanks.
Okay. All right, thank you. Let's see, Alex, it looks like there might be another question.
Yep, there is. So this is related to the last question. So for private sector businesses, is there recommended guidance that helps to develop a valid target and then measure the progress? And I think this person is right in saying this sounds easy, but it can be an overwhelming first step.
It's for Erica.
Erica, if it's okay, I'll take it first, and then you, since it's asking the private sector. For us, we are a company that's full of engineers, technical people. So for us, it has not been difficult, but I understand depending on a company's business, it could be all over the place. I think there are many services out there, right? Whether it's, you know, nonprofits or consultants out there who are more than able and ready to help. But that's a very valid question. It could be confusing. And the way we look at it pretty straightforwardly is we always refer, as Niclas says, we always refer to I refer to the source document of IPCC. We actually read through it. And then we said, this is what you need to get. That is a slope we must meet. And that's how we in IBM set goals to make sure you were consistent with the slow requirement called for by the ECC. Now that's easier said than done, and different company may have much more complex operations, different boundaries, and all I would say is there are many capable folks out there who can help, and there are also companies who are very willing to do benchmark to help other, go into conferences, share best practices. So that would be my comment.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I'll jump in here. I think really the first step in really trying to get a handle on your emissions and then how you want to go about reducing them as any organization, whether you're a small business, large business, etc., is first you need to know what you're emitting. So you need to figure out what your emissions inventory is, then understand kind of what your mitigation options are, and then committing to those mitigation options over a certain time frame. I will say that the Climate Registry in Southern California, Edison, actually piloted a small business program in early 2019 with exactly this in order to help different organizations and small businesses really measure, report, and then commit to reduce emissions over a certain time. And I think, especially for small businesses, this is a hurdle. So really excited that we were able to participate with the Climate Registry in this program, and looking forward and hoping that actually gets blown into a full-on program that the Climate Registry is able to manage and help small businesses through.
And Erica, thank you for the partnership with that. We're super excited about that program. There's so many small businesses in the US, and being able to help them achieve their carbon reduction goals is, I think, very much important part of the mosaic of having this carbon-free neutrality future. So, Niclas, did you want to add anything to this conversation?
I think most has been said. The only thing I would maybe add here is that there's always a learning curve, and for many companies and organizations, it's good to start small. You may not have to include everything from the start, but over time you need to expand and include, widening the borders for what you include. But maybe you just start with a small part of your company for start, just to learn. How do you do it? And it of course depends a lot on the business. We started 10 years ago to try to get the United Nations system itself climate neutral, and it took us 10 years. It's only now that we actually are climate neutral, and yes, we are using offsetting also to achieve that. So it's been a huge learning curve, but very useful also.
Yes, understanding a carbon footprint, that's a question that we deal with daily at the Climate Registry, and it's not necessarily easy. So we're always glad to help. One question I have in terms of these pathways and how some corporations are looking at their emissions, a number of them are looking back in terms of when they first became an organization or a corporation and saying, we're going to also offset those emissions from the origins of our existence. Is that, it's an interesting strategy. Does that help in terms of getting towards carbon neutrality goals, or should we just look at those emissions as being that was done? We've really got to focus on what we're emitting now. Any thoughts?
I'll offer some thoughts. I think the more you can do, if that's one way that you want to benchmark how you want to go further than just what you have before you in terms of emissions, and you want to look backwards and offset those as well, great, do it. If you're just starting out looking at just even understanding what your emissions are and looking forward and trying to figure out, okay, how can I help mitigate this, then great, do that. I think really in all of the above, emission reduction strategy is what we need right now, and certainly wouldn't want to judge anyone for doing whatever it is they're doing as long as they're trying to do something and really trying to hit that net zero goal.
Edon, do you have thoughts on that?
I think I'm where Erica is. I think I look at it as two separate issues, right? One is if you look at the science, any molecule that's been emitted, it's out there, right? The impact or the effects of emitted a molecule, it's been felt. So that's from a scientific standpoint, right? So, what is the actual effect of, quote, removing what you emitted? Kind of like like I said, the effect's been felt. With that said, I totally agree with what Erica said. If that's a way people want to express how seriously they're taking it, right? There are different ways you can express. You can say, look, I want to take out 3x more going forward. Or you want to say, well, I'm going to look back. I'm going to take out X based on that benchmark, right? I'm not passing any judgment. It's just your expression. At the end of the day, it's a company's way of saying, look, I'm gonna invest more in offset more than I need today. Okay, and that's just a way of this company expressing. And I think people, it's just, that's it. No, not better or worse.
Niclas, do you see that on the international landscape, that companies, corporations are using that strategy, employing that strategy?
Not so much, to be quite honest. I mean, there are some examples. I think the way that this is approached is not so much about legacy climate footprint, if you like. It's when it comes to the discussion among governments, that is a very difficult discussion, but in the corporate world, it's a little bit easier. But if you think about what offsets really are, they are investments in emission reductions. So you can say that, yes, I want to compensate for my climate footprint by investing in emission reductions, somewhere else, because I can't reduce everything at home today, and that is fine. Others saying that, well, we realize that there is really a big need for everybody to reduce. I mean, as a global society, we need to move really fast. And we're in a position where we can actually put a little bit extra money and investments in good emission reduction projects. Many times for companies are looking at the supply chains. So they're looking in the companies or the organizations that are delivering products and services to them. That is where they make the investments in emission reductions. I don't think there's any right or wrong here, to be quite honest. I agree with Eden and Erika what they said about it's really an opportunity. And it's difficult to say you have to do it. It's more about living in the now and see how do we move forward and how do we reach the targets that we have set ourselves.
And I think that's a good note to end on. How do we move forward? And hopefully we've added something to the conversation today. I want to thank you all, Eden, Niclas, and Erika, for joining us this morning or this afternoon, this evening, depending where you are. And with that, Alex, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you to our esteemed panelists. And just to let all of you on the session know, we're going to take a very short break so you can fill up your coffee cup, and we'll resume at 11 o'clock Pacific, 2 o'clock Eastern. Welcome back, everyone. I'd now like to introduce Chelsea Hasenauer, the Climate Registry's Manager of MRV Initiatives, who's leading on the Carbon Neutrality Database project. So with no further ado, Chelsea, over to you.
Thanks so much, Alex. And thank you all again for joining us today. Thanks to Niclas, Eden, and Erika for a very insightful panel a moment ago. And now I'm looking forward to telling you all a little bit more about the Climate Registry as well as the Carbon Neutrality Database project that we're embarking on. So with that, we can jump in just to quickly overview the Climate Registry and the work that we do. These are our 4 pillars of focus areas for work. Predominantly, we build capacity in GHG MRV, measurement, recording, and verification for organizations across diverse sectors and mostly focused in North America. But we also provide additional support for climate action and ambition with innovative new tools globally as well. And of course, we also like to provide additional support for organizations who are acting by showcasing and supporting their leadership, as well as providing recognition opportunities for their excellence in GHG reporting and managing those emissions. So just to dive into a couple of these relevant topic areas a little further, in terms of building capacity in GHG measurement, reporting, and verification, we author and publish best practice GHG reporting protocols. And we develop those protocols through multi-stakeholder consensus-based processes. We do that to ensure that the standards we develop are accurate and feasible for users of the protocols, as well as relevant to the stakeholders, so that they're including guidance and standards that are necessary and helpful for moving things forward in measuring and managing emissions over time, and obviously are making best practices more accessible to our participants and stakeholders. And beyond that, we aim to support more climate action and ambition via innovative new tools and initiatives to empower organizations to build effective programs and then ratchet up capacity and ambition within those programs. So we've done that recently through our work with the World Resources Institute to develop the Climate Implementation Tracker, which is an Excel-based tool that countries can use to track climate actions that they are taking to achieve their NDCs, nationally determined contributions. We've also recently supported California's low carbon fuel standard in helping to provide a accreditation and verifier training program so that folks participating in the low carbon fuel standard program have credible and quality data that they're using. So, given our position as a standard setter and thought leader in GHG MRV, we've heard from many stakeholders about some things that we need to address when it comes to carbon neutrality pledges, pathways, and claims in order to better support the diverse organizations that we work with in their global race to zero. So we've heard that organizations are struggling with what it really means to make a carbon neutrality pledge, that there's still a lot of confusion about what carbon neutrality language should be used, the diverse range of pathways that are being considered by different sectors, as well as even some struggle with the approach to setting a target in the first place. How do we choose a target that's appropriate for our organization? So at present, we know that there's a lack of transparency and consistency with respect to carbon neutral pledges and pathways. But we do know as well that there's a general consensus that cross-sector collaboration is important, that transparency and continued investment in progressing policies and technologies that help address the problem are all necessary right now and helpful avenues for addressing setting pledges and working towards them to achieve them. We also know that greater alignment around the common principles that underlay the different approaches would be helpful. So finding out some trends about the different pathways that folks are using. So we've all begun coming to a consensus about the problem areas and what needs to be done. But we hope to provide additional resources and address the remaining confusion or lack of consensus by using our multi-stakeholder consensus-based process that we do for our protocols to develop a carbon neutrality database. We're using a diverse group of expert stakeholders from around the world to develop the carbon neutrality database, and we hope that it will serve as a central repository for carbon neutral pledges and pathways. And the aim is that organizations and jurisdictions around the world will be able to collaborate and share information so that they can build capacity across diverse sectors. So we're hoping that organizations from all different shapes and sizes and walks of life will be able to share information about what it is that they're doing, what are the specifics of their carbon neutral pledge and pathway, as well as be fully transparent about the approaches that they're taking and the boundaries and scopes of those pledges and pathways, and that organizations who are hoping to learn from those who are leading in this space will be able to access that information and hopefully collaborate. Outside of that, we hope that organizations and jurisdictions with existing pledges will be encouraged to enhance their existing pathways so that they can level up. And of course, we'd like to empower the public a bit better to understand all of the different types of pledges and pathways and what's currently being done in this space and what needs to be done still further. So the database, we hope, will serve as a one-stop shop for information about carbon neutrality. In addition to the information that I just mentioned about carbon neutral pledges and pathways, increasing transparency about specifics there, we also hope that the database will include these other elements to support organizations in their journey to carbon neutral. So we're hoping to include research, guidance, and standards that are applicable to all sectors. And again, hoping to support collaboration directly within the database so that there is, again, cross-sector dissemination of information. So the platform will be a public web-based tool that can be easily navigated by multiple audiences. So we're hoping that the general public, corporates, policymakers, and others will all be able to access the tool easily and get the information they need out of it. Outside of that, we would like for the tool to have a search function that allows you to find carbon neutral pledges and pathways using specific criteria like sectors or timeframes or regions or specific approaches that are used to get to neutral, whether they be market mechanisms or decarbonization approaches. We also would like it to have a wide-ranging resource library that includes standards and protocols, as well as research around carbon neutrality pledges and pathways. There's been a lot of work into identifying trends across these pledges and pathways, so certainly we'd like for those types of information and studies to be housed in a resource library that's easily accessible. And then outside of that, we'd like for there to be some way for the data to be updated over time once it does get into the Carbon Neutrality Database. So we hope for there to be an update feature to ensure that the database and its data sets remain current and applicable. So with all that said, and with a quick introduction to the Carbon Neutrality Database, I just want to pause and thank our sponsors very much for helping us to launch this process. IBM, who you just heard from Edon on the panel, is one of our champion sponsors. And we've got great support from Cliff Family Foundation, Enlist Fund, and C2ES as well. So thanks very much for helping us to kick this off the ground. And then we can jump into the objectives for the projects. We've already heard a little bit more about the goals and what we need to address and hope to achieve. But in order to do that, we are planning to engage diverse stakeholders in the development of a framework for the database. So again, that engagement of stakeholders is hoping to ensure that the information included in the database is relevant and accurate, as well as helpful across both sectors and countries. And then outside of that, within the framework, we hope that we can help establish a common language for coming to a consensus on what it means to be carbon neutral. We also hope to discuss with our stakeholder groups credibility and transparency requirements in targets or claims, as well as the helpful tools and tips that organizations who are committed to or just embarking on the path to neutral might want access to in order to support their goals and progress. And outside of that, we also want to use the group to bring together as many examples as possible of successful pathways and innovative approaches to overcoming challenges. So the framework will essentially be a document that includes as much as possible in addressing each of those areas I just discussed, as well as some functional requirements, which I'll get into in a second. And those functional requirements will be focused on the usability of the web-based platform. Obviously, we would like to ensure that folks who go to the tool think it's easy to use and accessible, and that the information is easily provided to them so that they get something out of it. And then, of course, I already mentioned the need for maintaining the accuracy of the database over time. So we'll also be working with our stakeholder groups to produce procedures for populating and maintaining the database. So within that stakeholder consultation process that I've mentioned, the first phase will be focused entirely on developing that framework that I was just alluding to. And then the second phase of our database development process will be involved on those more functional aspects, which are development and testing of the web-based tool. So in the first phase, we'll be gathering feedback from our expert groups in the development of the framework and guidelines, which will include functional requirements that define users and desired user experiences, as well as specific criteria for disclosure. So those are things like establishing a common language, as I mentioned, addressing credibility and transparency requirements, and so on and so forth. So we'll be talking about all those different expectations and criteria for the data that are included in the database, and those things will be outlined in this framework. Outside of that, we'll also talk about the structure of the data and the best way to present it so that it can be easily consumed by multiple audiences. So after we've worked through phase 1 of our database development process throughout the next year with our stakeholder groups, we'll be moving on to phase 2 of the database development process, which is actually to build it. And that process will kick off towards the end of next year. So we'll have about a year of building the framework, which will be now until fall 2021. And then after that process is completed, we'll be moving on to building the database over the course of about a year. And so the first step in our stakeholder consultation process was to launch a stakeholder survey. We put out this survey to identify as many experts as possible and relevant stakeholders who were interested in contributing. And we received a really great response with 100+ experts from over 20 countries across the world responding to the survey and providing not only feedback on what the ultimate goals of the database should be, but also expressing their interest and areas of expertise in order to support its development. So from that stakeholder survey, we came up with 2 great stakeholder groups, the working group and the advisory committee. The working group is shown on the screen right now, and that consists of about 15 organizations who will be very hands-on through the database development process and will contribute to a lot of the decision-making and direction of the framework that we designed this year. And then in addition to that group, the advisory committee is made up of about 30 organizations, and they'll have a little bit less involvement, but still will be fairly engaged throughout the next year, contributing to the framework. And we're very happy with the broad range of expertise and background that we received in response to our survey, and the many different types of organizations that are represented here on our 2 groups, and hope that we'll achieve exactly what we're after, which is a relevant and helpful database to support organizations globally and across sectors. So I think with that introduction to what the database is and how it is that we plan to develop it with support from our experts, I can talk now about the poll questions that we launched at the beginning of the event. So we first asked all of you about whether your organization has a carbon neutral target currently. And I think the results that we got earlier today were about 50-50. So about 50% of our respondents said that they do have a carbon neutral target, and 50% said that they don't. I do think that it was a bit encouraging to see that on the question just after that, there was a note that about I guess the large majority of respondents were planning to set a target in the near term within the next 3 to 10 years. So that's certainly reassuring for those who don't have something in place yet. And this question was also asked of folks who responded to our stakeholder survey a bit ago. And we did see from those responses that, again, about 50% of organizations have set a carbon neutral target. But outside of that, for folks who were responding and their organization specifically hasn't set a target, they are working with or supporting others who do that. So namely here, this is in relation to consultants who are helping other organizations to set and achieve carbon neutral targets. So we're seeing a very large majority of our stakeholders who have set a target and are working towards its achievement at this point. outside of that, we also learned from our survey that exactly what types of data our stakeholders would like to see within the database. We left this as open-ended questions, so folks were able to provide as much information and ideas as possible, and we got quite a few great suggestions, but also got a lot of specific areas of data reiterated. So out of the trends that we saw from our survey, we did hear that transparency around scope 3 emissions and the quality and retirement of RECs and offsets, as well as consistency and definition and terminology, as well as the how of setting a target and the data requirements for removals or sequestration are all things that folks commonly replied as being helpful information to have in the database. And then additionally, we got a great list of the different types of audiences that we think the database should serve. So with that, I'd like to use these survey findings as a jumping off point for our next audience poll. So I'm going to start by asking all of you a couple of questions about how the database, how you think the database could best fill the needs that we're trying to address in the space. So I'll ask a few questions about what type of data you would like to see in the database, and you can vote for what you think would be most helpful as shown in the screen right now, as well as the audience that you think it will serve. And there will be a few additional questions about the database after that. And then once we've gotten through the questions about the database, I do have a few additional questions about your organization's carbon neutrality target, if you do have one, and getting to specifics about the boundaries there and what pathways you're choosing to achieve it. So we'll try to give about 20 seconds for each pop-up, just as before. I do think some of these questions might have a little bit longer question and answers than the start off poll, so we'll give a little more time if it seems necessary. And then we can look at the results and take questions afterwards. So I think you can go ahead and launch the first poll, Alex. And just as a reminder, you do need to answer all of the questions before you can hit submit. So make sure you at least choose one selection from each question, then hit submit. Okay. Can we show the results now, Alex? Okay. Oh, somehow the results just went away for me. So now I won't be able to read them out, but I'll review them later. If you want to launch into the next poll for another set of follow-up questions about carbon neutrality, the Carbon Neutrality Database, and getting input from these participants. And just for some added context, these types of criteria are the things that we'll consider with our stakeholder groups as we meet with them over the course of the next year and come to consensus about how it is that we should include these types of information within the database. All right, can we show the results now? Okay, now I can see them this time. And it seems like there's quite a spread about how folks should prioritize the activities within scopes related to the database, although the slight majority is that folks should address all scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions in their targets, which is certainly a lofty goal, but likely worthwhile. Outside of that, folks are aiming to address equity within their carbon neutrality targets. It seems like there's a tie for folks who are either already doing that or planning to do that as they set the targets. So certainly that's great news. On to the next then. Okay, this set of questions is related to your organization's use of offsets, if at all, with relation to its carbon neutrality target or pathways. And certainly if you work as a consultant or with an organization who might not necessarily need to set a carbon neutral target or has a very small footprint or something along those lines, you can feel free to respond to these things, giving your own opinion, as it will be helpful for our data collection that way too. And these answers do remain anonymous. Okay, sounds like folks are taking a little longer with this one, so we'll just give a couple more seconds to get your answers in. Okay. All right, so seems that folks by majority are relying on offsets to achieve their carbon neutral targets, or at least in some capacity. And then the approach to offsets seems to be a bit varied. So there's diversity being chosen above all else in the approach to offsets. And then outside of that, folks seem to be thinking that offsets can be used as a long-term tool to address unavoidable emissions. Of course, the responses here only have that as a slight majority, as others feel that it should only be used as a short-term solution. That's great, thank you so much. And I think we can move on to our last set of questions now. Oh, I see that the order of the database questions was reversed. So this is the one that you saw on the slide a moment ago, and folks expressed these different options as being the priority items for information to include in the database. So we'd like for you to vote on your preference as well. Okay, I think that was probably a short one if you want to show the results now, Alex. Okay, seems like scope 3 is a clear majority alongside the how of setting a target. So how folks are actually going about deciding on the target that they will be working towards. Is there one more, or are we done? Oh, one more. Okay, I'll give just a couple more seconds to get the responses in. And again, just want to thank everybody for participating in these polls. These types of questions are exactly what we'll be exploring throughout our stakeholder consultation process. So this type of early feedback helps us to narrow our conversations into what actually matters most to folks who will potentially use the database in the future. So very much appreciate your participation. Do you want to show the results now, Alex? So our last one is that folks seem most interested in learning more about examples of carbon neutral pathways and pledges with a focus on transparency, which is great because that is the overall goal of the database. And that within that transparency around pathways and pledges, folks are interested in learning more about the standards and guidance and quantification methods relied on by organizations setting these targets and choosing the pathways. So I think with that, we can close our polling section, and our last item is just to address any questions that folks may have on the project or otherwise.
Hey, so I realize we're almost at time, so just a quick comment and then I'll throw you a quick question, Chelsea. So just some folks have left links to some useful resources in the Q&A section, so I encourage you to take a look at those. And there are a couple of questions in here that are actually related, Chelsea, and basically they're around how the Carbon Neutrality Database will complement, interact with science-based targets and the work that that CDP is doing.
Yeah, definitely. So I think I've said a few times that the primary goal of the database is transparency around pledges and pathways. So the science-based target initiatives criteria for setting science-based targets will certainly be included within the database for transparency's sake. We'll make sure that organizations who are meeting their standards have that clearly and prominently displayed within the database. And folks may also have clear and transparent definition of how they're not meeting the science-based targets initiatives criteria, and perhaps have opportunity to provide narrative about why that is, and where their operations may be unique, and so on and so forth. So it will be included as a transparency aspect of the database. Outside of that, we'll certainly aim to include guidance and things like that come out of SBTI within the resource library. So, I think live in a few different places within the database.
Okay, I think that's it, and I think we'll just thank you all for joining us. We hope you really enjoyed the session. Thank you, Chelsea, and we'd love it if you stayed connected with us. So you can check out our website and subscribe for updates on the database. Follow us on social media, and or contact my colleague Alex Lilienfeld if you'd like more information. We hope you enjoy the rest of Climate Week. Stay safe and sane out there, and we look forward to staying in touch about this important and exciting initiative. Thank you.